The Digital Ghost, Chapter 1, The Echoes of 92. The scent of damp earth after a spring rain, mingled with the faint tang of coal smoke, clung to Mary's small house in the heart of Harper's Ferry, West Virginia. At 70, Mary was a woman weathered by time, her hands gnarled by years of work, her eyes, though still sharp, holding a deep, abiding sadness. Life in the hollows of Appalachia had been hard, unforgiving, but she had always faced it with a quiet, fierce determination. Her only son, Jake, now 45, was her anchor, her pride. But even Jake couldn't fully mend the gaping wound in Mary's heart, a wound inflicted by the year 1992. That was the year Daniel, her beloved husband, Jake's father, had left. Not by choice, she had always believed, but by circumstance. Work had dried up in Harper's Ferry, the mines closing, the factories shuttering. Daniel, a man of quiet strength and unwavering loyalty, had made the agonizing decision to go north, to the gritty industrial cities of the Midwest, to find work. Detroit, he'd said, was booming. He'd promised to send money, promised to call, promised to come home soon. And he had. For a few months, Daniel's calls had been Mary's lifeline, his voice, tired but hopeful, describing the grueling work, the loneliness, but always ending with a tender, "I love you, Mary. Tell our boy I miss him." Then one day, the calls stopped, abruptly, completely. Mary waited. She called the numbers he'd given her, only to find them disconnected. She contacted the police. They launched a missing persons investigation, but in the vast impersonal sprawl of a big city, leads quickly ran cold. Rumors circulated. A construction accident, a robbery gone wrong, or the most painful whisper, "He just ran off." Mary, in her heart, knew Daniel wasn't a man who would abandon his family. She clung to the hope of an accident, a tragic end, rather than the unbearable thought of a deliberate abandonment. Years turned into decades. The hope dwindled, replaced by a quiet grief. Mary raised Jake alone, teaching him resilience, instilling in him the values Daniel had embodied. She became a widow in spirit, mourning a man whose fate was unknown, a phantom lin ache in her soul. She eventually told Jake his father had died in an accident, a vague, kind lie to spare him the endless uncertainty. Life moved on. But the silence of Daniel's absence remained a constant, aching presence. Now in 2025, Jake, ever thoughtful, had bought Mary a new tablet. "Mom," he'd insisted, "you need to get with the times. So much to see out there, so many stories." Mary, resistant to technology, slowly, painstakingly, learned to navigate the touchscreen, to open YouTube, to search for old hymns and Appalachian folk music. One rainy Tuesday afternoon, as she idly scrolled through recommended videos, a thumbnail caught her eye. It was a local news segment titled "The Forgotten Artists of the City, a Story of Hope." The setting was a bustling city street, a familiar Midwest backdrop. A reporter with a microphone was interviewing an elderly man, his face weathered, his hair long and disheveled, but his eyes held a familiar intensity. He was sketching in a worn notebook, his hands moving with practiced grace. Mary froze, her heart hammered against her ribs. She leaned closer to the screen, her breath catching in her throat. The man spoke, his voice raspy, aged, but with a cadence that sent shivers down her spine. "They call me Dan," he said, his gaze distant. "I woke up in a hospital one day, with nothing. No name, no memories, just a blank slate. So I draw. It's all I have. Mary didn't need another word. The shock was a cold, physical blow. The face on the screen, aged by 33 years, etched with the lines of a hard life, was undeniably Daniel, her Daniel, the man she had mourned, the man she had believed dead, or lost forever. He was alive. And he was a homeless artist, living with no memory of her, of Jake, of their life, of the love they had shared. The digital ghost of her past had just materialized, shattering the carefully constructed piece of her present. Chapter 2: The Unraveling. The world tilted on its axis for Mary. Her Daniel, alive. The YouTube video played on a loop. The grainy image of her husband, lost to time and memory, burned into her mind. The phrase, "They call me Dan." I woke up in a hospital one day with nothing, no name, no memories, echoed in her ears, a haunting refrain. It was a cruel twist of fate, a brutal answer to a question she had long since buried. She called Jake, her voice trembling, barely coherent. Jake, turn on the TV. Go to YouTube. Search for the forgotten artists of the city. He's there, Jake. He's there. Jake, sensing his mother's profound distress, quickly found the video. His initial reaction was skepticism. "Mom, it could be anyone. There are a lot of older men who look similar." But as he watched, his words trailed off. The resemblance was undeniable. The way the man held his head, the set of his jaw, the particular intensity in his eyes when he spoke of his art. It was him, his father, Daniel. "He says he has amnesia, Jake," Mary whispered, tears streaming down her face. "He doesn't remember us. He doesn't remember anything." The pain of the revelation was sharp, almost unbearable. Daniel was alive, but the man she knew, the husband she loved, was gone, erased by an unknown trauma. Yet beneath the pain, a fierce, desperate hope ignited. After 33 years, she had a chance to connect with him, to bring him home, even if he was a stranger. Mary and Jake launched into a feverish investigation. They re-examined dusty boxes of old documents, police reports from 1992. The original missing persons report was thin, concluding with a "no leads." Notation: there had been no body, no concrete evidence of foul play, just disappearance. They contacted the news channel that produced the YouTube video. The reporter, a kind young woman named Sarah, was surprised but helpful. She confirmed that Dan was a resident of a local homeless shelter, known for his quiet demeanor and his beautiful charcoal sketches. She shared what little she knew about his background. He had been found unconscious near a construction site years ago with no identification and suffering from severe head trauma. He had been hospitalized, and when he recovered, his memory was completely gone. The hospital had discharged him to a local shelter, and he had drifted through the city's homeless community ever since, finding solace in his art. Mary's mind raced back to 1992, Daniel's last calls. He had mentioned feeling unwell, a persistent headache, and a rough crowd at the construction site. Had he been robbed? Attacked? Had it been an accident? The pieces of the puzzle, long scattered, slowly began to connect. Mary found old photographs of Daniel, his robust smile, his strong hands. She meticulously selected a few, hoping they might spark a flicker of recognition. She clutched a small wooden carving Daniel had made for her, a smooth, bird-shaped piece that fit perfectly in her palm. Perhaps the tactile sensation, The familiar craftsmanship would stir a memory. Jake, pragmatic as ever, arranged for them to travel to the Midwest city where Daniel now lived. Linda, Mary's steadfast friend, insisted on coming along, a comforting presence amidst the storm of emotions. The journey was long, filled with a nervous anticipation that bordered on terror. What if he truly didn't remember? What if he rejected them? What if the Dan they found was nothing like her Daniel? The homeless shelter was a stark contrast to the life Daniel had left behind. It was clean, but impersonal, filled with the quiet hum of forgotten lives. A kind social worker led them to a communal room, and there he was. Dan, sitting at a worn table, sketching intently, his face illuminated by the weak fluorescent light. He looked older, gaunt, his clothes worn, but the familiar posture, the way his head tilted as he concentrated, sent a fresh wave of grief and recognition through Mary. Her heart ached with a profound, almost unbearable love for this stranger who was her husband. The digital ghost had become flesh and blood, and now the true unraveling would begin. Chapter 3. A stranger's eyes. The air in the homeless shelter's communal room crackled with an unbearable tension. Mary's breath hitched in her throat as she saw him, truly saw him, for the first time in 33 years. He was thinner, his hair grayer and longer, his face etched with lines of a hard life she hadn't shared. But it was him, her Daniel. A profound, aching familiarity settled over her, a blend of relief and sorrow. Jake stood beside her, his hand gently resting on her back. His own eyes fixed on the man who was his father. He felt a strange mixture of anger, sadness, and an undeniable pull of recognition. This was the man from the faded photographs, the man whose absence had shaped his entire life. The social worker gently approached Dan. "Dan, you have visitors." Dan looked up. His eyes, those intense, familiar eyes, met Mary's. There was no recognition, no flicker of memory, only a polite, slightly wary curiosity. He was looking at her, his wife. As if she were a stranger, Mary took a shaky breath. "Daniel?" Her voice was a fragile whisper, thick with years of unspoken longing. He frowned slightly, shaking his head. I don't know that name. They call me Dan." His voice was raspy, but the timbre, the slight drawl, was undeniably Daniel's. Mary's heart splintered. This was the crushing reality of amnesia. He wasn't hiding. He simply didn't know. She approached him slowly, cautiously, as if approaching a skittish deer. She held out one of the old photographs, a picture of them on their wedding day, young and full of hope, beaming at the camera. "Do you remember this, Daniel? Our wedding day?" Her voice was filled with a desperate plea. He took the photo, his artistic fingers tracing the faded edges. He looked at the young couple, then at Mary, then back at the photo. A faint crease appeared between his brows. I don't, it feels familiar somehow, but I don't remember being there." He shrugged, a gesture Mary remembered so well. "It's like looking at a dream. I know the faces, but the memories aren't mine." Jake, his voice heavy with emotion, stepped forward. "Dad, it's me, Jake, your son." Dan looked at Jake, then back at the photo of the young Daniel. He saw the undeniable resemblance, a mirror image of his younger self staring back. A flicker of something, perhaps confusion, perhaps a ghost of a memory, crossed his face. "My son?" he repeated, his voice filled with a strange wonder. I have a son?" Mary pulled out the small, carved wooden bird. "You made this for me, Daniel. You loved to carve. You said it was a bluebird, for happiness." He took the bird, his thumb caressing the smooth wood. His eyes seemed to soften, a distant flicker of recognition in their depths. He looked up at Mary, a profound sadness in his eyes. I feel something and I hold this. A warmth. But the memory, it's not there." The social worker, sensing the profound emotion, gently suggested they give Dan some space. He's been through a lot. Amnesia is a complex thing. Sometimes small things can trigger faint echoes, but forcing it can be overwhelming. Mary and Jake left the shelter, their hearts heavy. They had found Daniel, but he was a stranger with her husband's face, her husband's voice, but without her husband's memories. The digital ghost had revealed himself, but he remained a ghost to his own past. The unspoken truth of his new life, his new identity, still lay ahead, a fresh heartbreak waiting to unfold. Chapter 4. The Unveiling of Dan. The initial meeting with Daniel, now Dan, left Mary and Jake in a state of profound emotional limbo. They had found him, but the man they knew was lost. The bitter pill of his amnesia was difficult to swallow. Mary brought more photographs, played old songs, even tried to cook his favorite meal, hoping a familiar taste or smell might unlock a buried memory. Dan was always kind, accepting, but the memories remained stubbornly out of reach. Like reflections in a murky pond. It's like looking at a book you once read, but someone tore out all the pages, Dan explained one day, sketching quietly. You recognize the cover, but the story is gone. Then came the next, even more painful revelation. The social worker, observing Dan's gentle nature and his strong bonds with certain individuals in the shelter, discreetly mentioned that Dan had a family of sorts. He's very close with a young woman named Hannah, she said. She visits him often. She's his daughter. Mary's blood ran cold. Daughter? Daniel had another daughter? This was a blow even harder than the amnesia. A new life, a new family, built on the ashes of his forgotten past. Jake, seeing his mother's shock, took the lead. He asked the social worker for Hannah's contact information. He explained the situation as delicately as possible, focusing on their search for a missing family member and the profound discovery of Dan's identity. The social worker, understanding the delicate nature of the situation, facilitated an introduction. The meeting with Hannah took place in a neutral coffee shop. Hannah was a vibrant woman in her mid-40s with bright, compassionate eyes that held a striking resemblance to Dan's. She arrived, clearly apprehensive, but with a fierce protectiveness in her gaze. You're saying Dan, my dad, has another family? Hannah asked, her voice trembling, her eyes darting between Mary and Jake. That his name is Daniel? And he was married? And had a son? Mary, through tears, confirmed it. Yes, his name is Daniel Miller, and I am his wife, Mary, and this is our son, Jake. Hannah's world tilted. My mom, she passed away a few years ago, Hannah explained, her voice thick with emotion. She met Dan years ago, after he was found. He was in the hospital, no memory. He told her everything. She loved him, helped him. They built a life together. She knew he had no past, no memories, but she never knew this. It became clear that Dan, in his amnesic state, had not deliberately chosen to betray Mary. He had simply built a new life from a blank slate, with a woman who accepted him, memoryless. Hannah's mother had loved him, had built a family with him, knowing only Dan, the man with no past. She had never known the depths of his lost history. the wife and son he'd left behind. Hannah shared her story. Her mother had found Dan in a local park, drawing. She had been drawn to his quiet sadness and his artistic talent. They had fallen in love. They never married officially, due to Dan's lack of identification, but they had a deep, loving partnership, and Hannah was their daughter. Dan had always been open about his amnesia, and Hannah had grown up knowing her father had a blank past. A profound, bittersweet realization dawned on Mary. Daniel had not abandoned them. He had been taken, robbed of his memories, and had built a new life out of necessity, out of a fundamental human need for connection and love. He had found a semblance of happiness, even without his past. The pain of her loss was immense, but the crushing burden of believing he had abandoned them lifted. The tension in the coffee shop was thick. Two families, intertwined by a man who had been lost and found. Two women, Mary and Hannah, who had both loved and nurtured him in different iterations of his life. Two sons, Jake and Hannah, now grappling with the fact that their father was a puzzle, a living mystery with pieces scattered across decades. The digital ghost had unveiled a complex, painful, but ultimately human truth. The path forward was unclear, but the silence of the past had finally been broken. Chapter 5. Two Lives, One Man. The emotional complexities of Daniel's dual existence weighed heavily on everyone. Mary, Jake, and Hannah, now bound by this shared, extraordinary secret, struggled to find a path forward. Daniel, oblivious to the storm he had inadvertently caused, continued to live his quiet life at the shelter, sketching, his memory still a vast, impenetrable void. Mary's initial impulse was to bring Daniel home, to immerse him in their shared past, to force him to remember. But Hannah's quiet protectiveness and Daniel's own gentle resistance to overwhelming stimuli made her pause. She realized that forcing him to remember might be a cruel act, tearing him from the only reality he knew, the one he had built with Hannah's mother. Jake, ever the pragmatist, suggested a gradual approach. He's still our dad, Mom, but he's also Dan. We need to respect that. And Hannah's mom, she loved him. She didn't know. Hannah, for her part, was grappling with her own pain. Her mother had never told her about her relationship with Dan being ambiguous, or the extent of his amnesia. Finding out her father had an entire life, a wife, and a son before her was a profound shock. Yet her love for Dan was unwavering. He was her father, the only one she had ever known. They started by introducing Daniel to small pieces of his past. Mary brought an old photo album, not to force memory, but to create a new shared experience. She would point to pictures of his childhood, of their wedding, of a young Jake, and tell him stories. She spoke of his favorite fishing spot, his quiet humor, his unwavering devotion. Daniel listened, his eyes often distant, but sometimes a flicker of something. A faint echo seemed to cross his face. "I feel a warmth," he'd say, holding a picture of Mary laughing by a river. "Like a dream I can almost grasp." Hannah, witnessing this, started to bring her own photos and stories of Dan's life with her mother. She spoke of his gentle presence, his love for her, his artistic passion. She shared how he coped with his amnesia, the quiet sadness he sometimes carried, a longing for something he couldn't name. It became clear that Daniel was not a blank slate. but a man with two distinct, deeply ingrained lives. The Daniel of 1992, the devoted husband and father, was buried under layers of trauma. The Dan of 2000s, the loving partner and father, was the identity he had constructed from his memory loss. They decided to pursue the cause of his amnesia more thoroughly. With the old police reports, the news reports of Dan being found near a construction site, and a new, more detailed medical record they obtained from the hospital where he was first treated, they uncovered more. Daniel had indeed suffered severe head trauma, consistent with a fall or a blunt force injury. There was a brief, vague police report from the time about a potential industrial accident at a less than reputable construction firm, but no leads were ever pursued due to lack of identification. It seemed Daniel had been a casualty of an unregulated, dangerous industry, discarded and forgotten. The emotional climax arrived when Mary, Jake, and Hannah decided to try and bring Daniel to Harper's Ferry, to the home he had left so long ago. It was a risky move, fraught with hope and potential heartbreak. As they drove, Mary pointed out landmarks: the old oak tree where they used to picnic, the river where he taught Jake to fish, the winding roads he knew so well. Daniel looked out the window, his expression unreadable. When they arrived at the house, a wave of emotion washed over Mary. It stood as a testament to their life together, a silent monument to love and loss. Daniel stepped out of the car, looking at the familiar porch, the garden Mary tended so meticulously. He paused, his gaze fixed on the front door, a moment of profound silence. Then he raised a hand, slowly, tentatively, and touched the weathered wood of the doorframe. A shudder ran through him. "I know this place," he whispered, his voice hoarse, filled with a sudden, overwhelming emotion. This feels like home." Tears streamed down Mary's face. Jake's eyes were glistening. A faint, almost imperceptible crack had appeared in the impenetrable wall of Dan's amnesia. It wasn't a full return, but it was a beginning. A small, painful, yet incredibly hopeful step towards bridging the two lives, two families of one man. The digital ghost had returned to his roots, bringing with him the bittersweet echo of two lives, now undeniably intertwined. Chapter 6: The Divide. The moment Daniel whispered, "I know this place," was a watershed. It wasn't a complete recovery, not a sudden flood of memories, but a profound emotional resonance, a confirmation that the core of Daniel, the man Mary loved, still existed beneath the layers of Dan. This small victory, however fragile, emboldened them. The immediate challenge was not just Daniel's memory, but the delicate balance between Mary and Hannah. Both women had loved and sustained a version of Daniel. Both felt a fierce claim to him. They spent hours talking, sometimes heatedly, but always with an underlying respect for each other's pain and love. Hannah shared stories of Dan's life with her mother, of his quiet joy in their simple routines, of the comfort her mother had found in his gentle presence. Mary, in turn, shared the vibrant Daniel of their youth, his dreams, his humor, the unwavering love they shared. It was during these conversations that the two families began to truly see each other, not as rivals, but as fellow travelers on a shared journey of understanding. Jake, with his pragmatic approach, became the bridge between them. He spent time with Daniel, talking about sports teams from 1992 old Appalachian jokes, small snippets of their life. He brought him old photographs, not just of his family, but of his friends, his old truck, his fishing gear. One day, while looking at a picture of his old fishing boat, Daniel paused. "The Bluebell," he murmured, a distant look in his eyes. She was temperamental, always pulling to the left. Mary and Jake exchanged shocked glances. He remembered the name of his boat. It was a small detail, but a monumental breakthrough. Slowly, painfully, fragments of Daniel's past began to surface. A scent might trigger a forgotten image. A song on the radio might bring a fleeting moment of clarity. He would wake up from dreams with a feeling of profound sadness, a sense of loss he couldn't articulate. He still called himself Dan, but the Daniel within was stirring. The cause of his original disappearance also became clearer. Through persistent inquiry by Jake, the old police records were re-examined. There was a small, overlooked detail: a report of an unidentified man being found unconscious near a construction site owned by a shady company known for unsafe practices and connections to organized crime. It was likely Daniel had stumbled upon something, or been a victim of a workplace accident that was covered up. He was just another faceless casualty in a dangerous world, discharged from the hospital without identification, left to navigate the city's underbelly, his memory stolen. The future for Daniel was not a simple return to his old life. He was fundamentally changed. He was both Daniel and Dan. He decided to split his time between Harper's Ferry, where Mary and Jake lived, and the Midwest city where Hannah resided. It was a compromise, a complex arrangement that reflected his dual identity. He was learning to be a father to Jake again, to connect with the man his son had become. He was learning to be a father to Hannah, to truly appreciate the life he had built with her mother. And for Mary, he was a dear friend, a man with whom she shared a deep, enduring history, even if the romantic spark of their youth was now a gentle ember. Mary found a new purpose in advocating for families of missing persons, especially those whose loved ones might be living with amnesia or other forms of mental illness due to trauma. She spoke at conferences, shared her story, and helped found a local support group for families like hers. She used her pain to help others, turning her decades of suffering into a source of profound strength. Jake, too, found a deeper understanding of his father. He visited Daniel often, cherishing the quiet moments, the shared silences, the occasional flash of the old Daniel. He understood that his father had been a victim, not a betrayer. His anger dissipated, replaced by a profound empathy. The story culminates not in a fairy tale reunion, but in a powerful testament to the resilience of the human spirit. Daniel, the digital ghost, had been found. He was not the man he once was, but he was alive, and he was loved by two families who had learned to bridge the divide of a lost past and a new present. Mary no longer lived with the agonizing uncertainty. She had her truth, and in that truth, she found her peace. The echoes of 92 had finally found their bittersweet resolution, a symphony of acceptance, forgiveness, and the enduring, complex nature of love. The digital ghost had found his way home, not to a singular past, but to a mosaic of lives, forever intertwined. Chapter 7: A New Symphony of Life. Years had passed since Daniel, now comfortably embracing his dual identity as Dan, divided his time between Harper's Ferry and the Midwest city. The initial shock and raw pain had softened. mellowing into a profound acceptance. The family that once seemed irreparably broken had found a new, unconventional harmony, a testament to the resilience of the human heart and the enduring power of connection. Mary, at 75, moved with a newfound lightness. The burden of Daniel's unknown fate had been lifted, replaced by the bittersweet reality of his presence. She cherished his visits, the quiet conversations on the porch swing, the way his eyes, sometimes filled with a distant memory, would crinkle when Jake made him laugh. She no longer sought to force his old memories. Instead, she focused on creating new ones, building bridges between Daniel and Dan, between his past and his present. She understood that he was a survivor, not just of a physical trauma, but of a profound erasure, and her love for him now encompassed both the man she married and the man he had become. Her advocacy for families of missing persons gained traction. Mary's story, The Digital Ghost, as it became known, was featured in national magazines and online documentaries. She became a voice for the forgotten, a beacon of hope for those clinging to faint threads of connection. Her home in Harper's Ferry became a quiet sanctuary, a place where people struggling with similar losses could find solace and guidance. Jake, now well into his 40s, reveled in his renewed relationship with his father. He understood that Daniel would never be the dad of his childhood memories, but Dan offered a new, precious bond. They bonded over art, with Jake learning to appreciate Dan's charcoal sketches and Dan, in turn, showing a quiet interest in Jake's carpentry projects. Jake often found himself in the Midwest city, visiting Hannah and sharing a meal with Dan, witnessing the beautiful, unconventional family unit they had built. Hannah had fully embraced her role as a bridge between her two families. Her love for Dan, her father, was unconditional, and she admired Mary's strength and resilience. She often brought her own children to Harper's Ferry, introducing them to their extended family, ensuring that the legacy of both Evelyn Miller and Daniel Miller was woven into the fabric of their lives. She and Jake developed a strong sibling bond, finding comfort and understanding in their shared experience of having a father who lived two lives. Michael, the subject of Mary's other story, The Silent Shadow, remained a distant, cautionary tale, a stark contrast to Daniel's story of accidental disappearance. He was a reminder of deliberate choice, while Daniel represented unforeseen tragedy. Daniel himself found a strange, peaceful equilibrium. His art flourished, each sketch a testament to his present existence, even as faint, tantalizing glimpses of his past occasionally surfaced. He still preferred to be called Dan, but the name Daniel no longer startled him. He accepted the love from both Mary and Hannah, cherishing his role as a father to both Jake and Hannah. He found joy in the simple routines of both lives, the quiet solace of sketching in his notebook, the laughter of his grandchildren. He was a man suspended between two worlds, yet fully present in each. The digital discovery had been the catalyst, an unforeseen miracle delivered by a modern age. It had ripped open old wounds, forced painful truths to the surface, and shattered comforting illusions. But ultimately, it had led to healing, to a profound understanding of love's many forms, and to the expansion of family beyond traditional definitions. Mary would often sit on her porch, looking out at the mountains, a peace settling over her that she hadn't felt in decades. The man she had loved, lost, and mourned was alive. Not the same, but undeniably here. The digital ghost had returned, bringing with him a new symphony of life, a complex, beautiful melody of resilience, forgiveness, and the enduring, unbreakable threads that bind a family, even across the vast, silent chasms of time and memory. Her journey was a testament to the fact that even when fate deals the cruelest hand, love, in its myriad forms, always finds a way to resonate.